With that, welcome everyone to the second session of our metrics series. Over the next 15 to 20 minutes, we're going to be diving deep into 5 top-line metrics. So anything from volume metrics and SLAs to bottom of funnel metrics that legal has exclusive insight into. So stay tuned for that. We will be covering a lot. Basically, we want to give you twice the amount of information in half the time, so stick with us. We're going to look at a few key performance indicators, KPIs, that we'll reference throughout, and how they can enable strategic business partnerships across your organization. Just a few housekeeping items as we move through. Please feel free to use the Q&A box. No one will see these questions except the panelists, so don't be shy in asking questions. After, we will be sending you the recording and the slides, so no need to take notes. We'll send it everything that you need. And we will have time for questions at the end, so please feel free, again, to use that Q&A box. If we don't get to your question, someone will reach out to you after and follow up with you there. With that, I'm Mary. I am the Growth Marketing Manager here at LinkSquares, so I get to join these webinars from time to time, and I'll pass it off to Simon to introduce himself.
Hi there all. Very excited for today. My name is Simon Scanchi, VP of Operations at LinkSquares, and I lead a few different functions. One of them, services, which I get to interact with Jonathan and the legal team quite a bit on drafting statements of work and other things related to our engagements with customers. And another group I lead is the analytics team. So we're actually helping Jonathan and team put together a lot of the fun reporting that we're going to talk about today from a metrics perspective. So very excited for the discussion. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Jonathan?
My name is Jonathan Greenblatt. I'm the Vice President of Legal at LinkSquares. And I have to say, Simon's team has helped me so much over the last 3 years with his analytics. I've never had such great access to analytics, and the benefits are manyfold. So really excited to talk about how we've been using analytics in our organization to really make sure the legal team is operating very effectively.
Fantastic. Thank you both. Happy to have you. Before we dive in, I just wanted to make sure that if you weren't able to join us for session 1, that we gave you an overview of what we discussed so you feel totally in the loop. We explored the importance of metrics in maintaining consistent output, basically as your team gets bigger, as your team shrinks. We also did a deeper dive into how to align your legal strategies with your broader organizational goals. And we talked about how all teams have metrics. So not just legal, not just marketing, not just RevOps, the entire organization has metrics that they look at across the board. Anything to add from either of you about aligning metrics with your organizational goals?
I think this captures it well. Metrics are something every team should be thinking about. And it's when we all we divide and conquer as an organization. And part of what holds us back together is the metrics that we can look at and make sure we're all accountable for doing what we say we do in each of our respective teams.
Perfect. We also talked about how metrics help you be a better strategic business partner. And Jonathan, I know this is something you're very passionate about, so I'd love to hear from you what it means to be a strategic business partner as a legal leader.
Yeah, as a legal org and as a leader specifically, it's really important to understand the expectations of all of your clients, and those are the other business units you'll interact with. So understanding what needs they're going to need from the legal department and being proactive in figuring those out versus just having request after request come in through the door without any sort of alignment as to what the specific goals of the leaders of your fellow business units, what they need, is going to be a recipe for disaster if you're just doing it one off. So it's really important to understand what those other business partners want from the legal team. And with that, particularly for things that are going to happen repeatedly, it's also very important to understand what is the timing expectation, because I think that really drives how the legal department is seen, as whether or not they're meeting the expectations of the timing of the legal department's input into the process.
I mean, I need Jonathan's team to do things for my group regularly, and the same is true, vice versa. And part of being a strategic business partner is communicating priority and managing to it effectively. We're all sort of working together to get a job done. And communicating effectively, I think, is sort of core to being a strategic business partner.
Mhm.
And it's heavily influenced by data, which is helping us identify outliers in cases where we go, oh, shoot, something broke. What do we do about it? Let's get together and talk and strategize how to work through whatever respective circumstances.
Yeah, and it's so important to just have those goals that we've set out with Simon, so he knows what he can expect from us. Because at a certain point, now he knows he can get upset if we've agreed upon a plan and aligned as to what his expectation should be. There's a point where if we're not meeting that, Simon can be upset. But anytime before that, he's going to give me the space. So of course, there's always exceptions that then just should be properly communicated. But he's going to give me the space and my team the space to be able to work towards that timing goal we've agreed to.
So let's dive into what our top line metrics are and what we even mean by top line metrics. We mentioned earlier that all teams measure and manage size and specifically related to whether growing increased headcount or showcasing your team's work. So Simon, I'd love to hear from you how you think about top line metrics and kind of how you help Jonathan define his top line metrics as well.
Yeah, sure. So first off, I think legal as a shared services organization, metrics are more important to those groups than any other because it's so easy to just knock on legal's door and say, "Hey, where does this thing stand?" I think Jonathan hit on it well, where it's I don't have a right to be angry if we're within SLA, right? But I do have a right to say, "Hey, what's going on here?" if things are taking longer than I would expect them to. And so what I think about when I think about metrics is results orientation of the team. There's a million metrics that we could watch, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to tell like a very succinct story with a few metrics that I'm putting together to know whether my business unit is operating the way it should be or not. I can always dive in a couple layers deeper to answer why if they're not, but I have to have a few that I can watch in a trended way over time that give me kind of the signal that things are operating kind of the way that they should. And something else to consider here is who your stakeholders are. We're not just watching metrics for metrics' sake, we're watching them to create some level of visibility into what our organization is doing and how it's going. And I'm going to put together some metrics that I want sales to be able to see. I'm going to make sure that I'm meeting SLAs with them. I'm going to put some metrics together that I want the board to see to be able to show the results and the amount of effort that my team is putting into to get deals done. And so you have different lenses that should all be applied to kind of the same data. You got to think about what stakeholder questions you're trying to answer and kind of who those stakeholders are simultaneously. Then you package that up nicely, and you should be able to tell a pretty good top line story of how your group is performing on any time horizon.
I think one thing to add, because people often ask me, where do I start with metrics? I think it's newer to the legal department than to other
Mm-hmm.
organizations. And what I tell them is figure out what those top line metrics are and then figure out your baselines. I think it's not good to try to create aspirational goals as to what you expect your metrics to be without historically looking and seeing what have they been previously. Once
Mm-hmm.
you know that, then you can start saying, cool, well, now what do we aspire to?
Yeah, that's great and brings us to our next point. Jonathan, let's walk through all of these metrics, starting with volume metrics.
Yeah, so I think volume metrics are an especially good place to start if you're new to the metrics game. Just figuring out how many requests have been received by the legal department, in what area they are per request. That's going to start giving you insight into how much work the team is doing. So it's really an easy metric to capture,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it should be just a general understanding of any legal leader to understand how what volume of work is coming through the legal department. So with that, I think for us, it's really important to understand the total number of requests. You can split that out. That's probably a sub metric of just overall volume. I know
Mm-hmm.
here at LinkSquares, we track how many requests were submitted to the legal department, how many legal matters or contracts have been reviewed within a certain time frame, and then how many of those contracts that were reviewed by legal were signed. So just getting that volume is really good to start figuring out the breakdown of how much work your team is doing. And then from there, you can start moving really to that team area where you're starting to look at the team and you're saying, cool, is this a metric that my team can support? Because if you have one contracts counsel or contracts administrator working on 50 to 70 contracts over 2 weeks, that might just be too much for any individual to support. And that the organization at that point doesn't have reasonable expectations. You also wanted to start figuring out, cool, how long is it taking for my legal department to turn around requests? And those could be net new requests, they could be contracts that are being negotiated, but how long is it going to stay with the legal department? Super important to understand that, because again, that does tie to your volume metrics. If it's 10 requests a week, but the turnaround time is extremely fast, that might not be fair to your resources to try to turn it around in that time frame. Again, find the baseline and then figure out what's the optimal way to do it. And then, particularly for anybody that's new to starting putting SLAs, like start putting SLAs towards that. That's really going to help your team align with the rest of the organization. And I found has also just given the legal team more breathing room. And there's just less things just kind of hanging out there that haven't been done. Two more metrics to go. So like time to close, essentially, like, sometimes you're looking at the internal legal metrics, but you're also looking more broadly at metrics that the organization is going to want to understand as a whole. How long does it take for a document to get through my vendor process? So if maybe tomorrow someone submits a vendor request, what is the expected timeline that it will go through not just the legal process, but the entire process? Is it a week? Is it 2 weeks? Is it a month? Is it 2 months? Simon, I know we work a lot on procurement items, and Simon wants to know not necessarily just how the legal department is turning around things, but we have many other stakeholders involved in a procurement process. Well, how long does it take from the start of that contract to the end? And then lastly, bottom of the funnel metrics are something that we track here at LinkSquares. We love this data because it's not just relevant to us, it's actually relevant for our sales team. And we started capturing these metrics when our CLO was able to be a more accurate predictor than our chief revenue officer at the time, because he was looking at not just the open and closed opportunities that the sales team was working on, but he was like, well, where are they in the contract negotiation process? It's going to be very different expectation if you're coming to your last day of let's say it's a quarterly goal, and there are 75% of the contracts that are being worked on are sitting in a ready for signature stage versus a internal review stage. And it's perhaps it's just the first internal review, knowing that most likely it's going to be negotiated. So that metric in particular is relevant for the entire organization.
I like some of what we've looked at specifically related to some of our services SOWs, and thought about, wait a minute, why when we start to splice the data by, number of requests and time to close, does it feel like those are taking a while? And then we can start digging in and realizing actually it's because we have quite a few parties across teams involved in putting those together from a scoping perspective that results in like time expansion. So then we have the data there, right? We can sit down and look at it and say, wait a minute, how can we do this differently, right? Like, how can we think about the baseline that we have today and say there's room for improvement here? And despite the best of our intentions, it's taking longer than we probably want it to for our customers. And that, I look at this, are these all the right metrics? Absolutely. I think I could apply these metrics to sort of any business unit that I would kind of operate. Actually, I think the bottom of funnel stuff is like fascinating visibility that the legal team has into the close process that doesn't totally exist in our CRM as an opportunity stage today. It's kind of like greater fidelity into likelihood to close. So I think that's like a fascinating new area for legal to be thinking about playing a role in, is forecasting deal, likelihood. But one thing I'll add here is faster is great, but you have to like understand that there's a trade-off between speed and quality. And what you'll see is that's not on the screen, because it's actually quite hard to measure, is how good was the work that was performed? How good of a job did legal do in the process of delivery? And I think that's an area that we can all, sort of improve. I think about sort of the post case type surveys that we send to customers and say, not only did we get the job done for you, but how satisfied were you with the job that we did? And you use that kind of as a trade off and balance to, did we do it effectively? Did we do it efficiently? Did we do it in the time that we said we would? And did we do a good job? Put all that stuff together, and you got a well operating group here. Yeah, I think this covers it, pretty well. That's just the one that I would add, but acknowledge it's pretty difficult to measure one. We'll figure out ways to better do that in the future.
And there was one that you both talked about, which is the bottom of funnel metrics. Jonathan, this is something I know you're really excited about. So can you walk us through what your thought process is here when you're looking at bottom of funnel metrics?
Yeah. So I think this chart really gives you a good picture of the difference in insight that you get from bottom of the funnel metrics relating to sales contracts, but you could even think of it for procurement contracts if folks are trying to understand what volume of dollars is tied to the procurement process and where things are in the procurement process. But it really tells you, as I was mentioning before, if there's still review processes involved in the contract, then most likely that's going to be a little bit more challenging to get it to close. It certainly might, but when a CRO, for instance, is trying to make a forecast out to the CEO as to what will be expected by the end of the quarter, having that insight into where a contract is in those latter stages will help the CRO provide a more accurate picture.
Isn't that what we're all looking for? Better forecasting?
Yeah. And I think with a lot of these metrics, I think the legal team, I think those of us in the legal team know we are a nerve center for the organization. And so these metrics can really help show the organization that value proposition and help them and other business teams make better decisions based on the data that's in the legal hopper.
Absolutely. If there are any questions, please drop them in the chat now. But we did have one come in during the slide with all the top line metrics, and it's how do you evaluate efficiency in executing contracts within your organization?
Yeah, so I think there's two metrics that we talked about that are very helpful to look at efficiency in a contract review process. One is the overall time it takes for a contract to go from an initiation stage to a signature stage. That's certainly one. And then the other is looking at the legal team's own involvement in that and looking around how long does it take for a contract to go through the legal department cycle. Like you can't really necessarily, the legal department can't necessarily control the other side.
Mm-hmm.
But what is legal's role when it comes into legal? How long does it take for legal to process it? And when it goes to the wider lens data point as to how long does the contract take, that's actually some of our other business stakeholders can actually influence the process. If oftentimes I have seen in the past where it's been a procurement contract and our team has negotiated it fairly quickly and it just sits with the other side. Well, has any of our business partners, have they ended up following up and checking with the other side, is that contract ready for our review? Because oftentimes what we find is they haven't. And hey, what we need to now do looking at the data is know that, hey, actually the business stakeholders need to start pressing on that more.
Jonathan, how do you surface that and give that feedback to other groups? Like imagine you arrive at a circumstance where, man, legal team is super efficient in turning things around, but geez, it's always waiting on, I don't know, let's pick on Rob. It's always waiting on IT or security to do their part. How do you manage to that knowing that you have data at your avail?
Yeah, absolutely. So first is you need to make sure that you're reading the data right. And this is what usually happens is it's something anecdotal that will trigger a complaint. And the beauty of data is the data doesn't lie. And so if there's an outlier, if something is stuck with IT, first thing I'm going to do is make sure I understand, was this a one-off case, or was this something where this is actually regularly going on? And if it's just a one-off, then I think you just have a side conversation with your respective business partner, and you can make sure that everybody understands where the delay was lying. But I don't think there's really a remedial action that needs to be taken. Now, if the trend is, and I think you need to highlight that to the organization, actually what we're seeing is that this was just an outlier.
Mhm.
But when you're noticing it's not an outlier, now you need to start taking remedial action and making sure that all of the business orgs that are part of whatever process are held accountable for doing their part.
Yeah, it's something that I didn't hear there, but I just assume too is if you have good tracking there and accountability, you go, hey, this isn't a legal problem because sales will come to us and say, hey, legal, you're holding something up. And you say, whoa, whoa, whoa. Actually, it's the process overall that's
Mhm.
not moving at the pace that you want. But there are, I think, like you said earlier in the call here, there are many parties involved in the overall process, and legal just plays a portion of that role. But altogether, we need to effectively deliver. And Rob, apologies, just using you as an example did not mean that as a pick on you.
I know too, something that we've talked about with being a strategic business partner and having that ongoing communication is it makes these conversations a little bit easier to have that one-off conversation, like you mentioned, Jonathan, like, hey, what happened here? We know this is not like the norm for you. What's going on? And same thing if it is starting to become the norm, you have to have those conversations and it makes it much easier to do if you've already kind of built that relationship and have that communication, that open line of communication.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think about it as a step counter. So let's say my goal is to hit 10,000 steps a day. Now I can look back to see, have I been hitting my steps? And if on one day I didn't hit the steps and it's because, well, I look back and say, wow, that was just a crazy day at work. That was a real
Mhm.
big exception. I know I don't really need to make a behavioral change in how I'm operating if I'm consistent on the rest of my days. But if I'm now noticing that, hey, I'm only walking 2,000 steps, now I need to start thinking, cool, how do I need to change things so I can start hitting my goals consistently?
I love that analogy. That's perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining. Very much appreciated. There will be a part 3, so stay tuned for that invite in your email inbox. But with that, thank you, everyone. And thank you, Jonathan and Simon. Great insights as always. And we hope to see you on the next one.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.